Let's make sure it starts. Great. And so we are on part 2 of our session. Last time we really talked about forming the team, figuring out what you want to do for the review. We talked about research questions. We talked about how do you select members for your curriculum review team. We talked about how you make that team start to work effectively. We also talked about the overall process of a review from start, kind of what do you do first in a year towards the end of the year. We also talked about what does it look like to start one year and do it into the next year, kind of the overall trajectory of a curriculum review. And we also talked about the literature review process in there. And again, we'll share out that recording with you so that you can go back and revisit and enjoy that. Welcome, or good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you're coming from. I'm hoping that for most of you, it's a good evening or afternoon for that. So welcome. My name is Andrew Miller, Director of Teaching and Learning at Singapore American School. I got with me my partner in crime, Gynelle, who wants to say hello.
Hello, everybody. Nice to see you all again.
And so we are here to just continue to share our learnings and processes as we did this, and as we're continuing to do it at our school, around how to review your curriculum and how to engage in that continuous improvement process. So we're going to jump right in and get going and try to stick to really a 60-minute mark on this and leave time for questions at the end. It's that whole Zoom fatigue. I'm sure for some of us, I think about an hour is the most I can handle myself personally. All right. And then Gynelle and I used to be in doctoral classes on Zoom for 3 hours or more. That was really hard. No more, though. No more. This is good. So those were our part 1 outcomes. Again, we're really to overview that process and to talk about constraints and decision-making and all those things and creating that core review team. And then again, doing that research. Our outcomes this time are really focused in on data. Now that you know what you want to find out, now that you have a sense of here are the questions we want to explore, we're going to talk about how do you determine the right data to collect? How do you think through collecting data on systemic beliefs of teaching and learning of your faculty? How to design parent, student, faculty focus groups, and then how do you engage your team that you formed in meaningful data dialogues to process that data. So let's get started. Hopefully we got a bunch of data nerds in the house and they enjoy looking at that as instructional leaders. So that's what we do, right? We're always data driven. So that's really why we spend a lot of time on this is we want to make sure that what we're doing is based in data, both in terms of research that we were looking at last time, what is the research telling us, but also in terms of what kind of data are we collecting that informs our decisions, and start to look through those themes and think through it. The first thing I'll say about this, just as a general statement, is really thinking through how are you going to balance that qualitative and quantitative data approach. And we're going to talk more about kind of what that might look like. But really this means when I think through sometimes review processes I've been a part of, I've seen kind of the pendulum swing in both directions. I've seen reviews where it's all about the qualitative and it's all about how people feel and their perception without paying attention to some quantitative. And then I've also just seen quantitative where it's like, let's look at our test scores. Let's look at the frequency of this, but you're not taking into getting that depth and that real understanding. Quantitative can give you that frequency and kind of that nice pulse on things. Qualitative gives you that depth. And it really supplements and adds color to what you're trying to find out in your process. So really think through that, like how are you going to do that? And we're going to show you what that might look like, for instance.
Okay, so we had our big questions, our review questions, and then we thought, okay, so what do we really need to find out from our stakeholders? So if you can go to the next slide, Andrew, please. So we really had some specific questions that we had to ask ourselves to be able to think about what we were going to collect, how we were going to collect it. So what specific topics? So related to the big review questions, what specific topics do we want to ask about? Then we need to really consider what is the best source of data or the way to gather data. Are you going to do learning walks? Are you going to do focus groups? Are you going to do interviews? So depending, there's pros and cons on different types of data collection sources. And so you really need to decide what's the best for the purpose that you're trying to meet. And then when is the best time to collect that data with schedules, with different things. And then this one, who are we, the current reality, and who do we want to be, the future state, was actually something Andrew and I went back and forth on. So you really need to decide. Sometimes you have a review where you really are just looking at the current reality. And so because you already have a vision for what you're trying to accomplish, sometimes you don't really have that vision. And so you want to create that vision along the way. So for example, in math, we knew that we had that hunch that we were going to have to create a vision. So when we designed our questions, we really had some questions around current reality and the future state, because we really wanted to see where did we want to head. Okay. So as we were thinking about that, we were trying to really synthesize, where are we, who are we collecting the data from? Where are we getting it from? And you can see that we had the blue, the who are we, and then who do we want to be? So from teachers, we looked through the observations. We did some observations and learning walks. Then we had them do a curriculum audit, which Andrew will share some tools that we used in just a little bit. We also looked at the WASC data that the teachers had helped collect the year prior. And then we really considered the student experience and the data, as Andrew said, that quantitative data that we needed. And so we didn't just have focus groups with the current students, but we also wanted to know from that alumni, especially as we think about when they move on to university, like what really helped them move on into their life. So we included both groups of students. And then of course we had parent groups. We chose to do focus groups with the parents and the students, just so that we could have more voices because of our capacity there. And then for the future with the teachers, we really wanted to look at a belief survey, which we did. We'll share that with you. And then again, like I said, the curriculum audit and the focus groups helped us with that as well.
Yeah, and the thing I'll jump in on here is you'll notice that some data collection tools are just for the future state or just for the current state, and some might cross. So when I share about focus groups with parents, for example, you'll see questions that are about the current reality and questions about the future state, just to kind of highlight that it really depends on how you design those data collection tools.
So once we decided who, and we decided some of those topics, then we really had to dig in. And so one of the questions is, how do you decide, or how do you know how to write good survey and focus questions? And so here's just a couple of sources that we used to design some of those questions. Another really good way to help you figure out your assessment tools is to look online. Just Google math review surveys or math curriculum survey or social studies curriculum survey. And there's a lot of things out there, and that really informed what we were doing. Andrew, would you go back to slide 56 and click on the link on math review data collection summary?
Yeah, can. All right, let's see if this opens up. Here we go.
So this was how we organized our thinking. So you can see at the very top, we had our goal, and then we had the framework that we were using, and then those overarching questions. And then if you remember correctly from last time, we had some categories. So one was the purpose of math with instruction and curriculum. And then we had, so those other ones are instruction. And then we went through, and if you can see at the top, the data tool, that's where we started to think based on that grid that we showed you a minute ago, like, what are we really trying to collect? And then when are we going to collect that? So we had this for all of the different sections that we were trying to collect data on. And then we were able to look at those questions and refine our questions as we developed the surveys and the interviews.
Yeah, and so you'll see, for example, we did some of these things on our in-service days, for example, or we did them just on a survey sent out to parents, or we just did it during school with a group of students. So just to kind of name that, it all depended, but you'll see you'll see the alignment between the literature review that we showed you last time. So when we're doing literature about intervention, for example, then we will make sure that we have questions and data to support that as well.
And the question last time about the core team meeting, we actually did a lot of this work with them. Like, for example, there was learning walks that we took the math I did the math, so I'm speaking about math, but we, in general, you take your core team during those days that they have off with subs. Okay. Over to you, Andrew.
Awesome. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the data collection and how we did some very specific data collection protocols. I'm going to focus in on curriculum auditing, instructional walks, and then I'm going to focus in on parent focus groups as kind of like a case study to think about other focus groups, right? Because it's very similar. But I think the parent one provides the most, for me personally, provides the most interest in terms of thinking through the opportunity to both build community and also really listen deeply to your parents and other community members. So the first one is really this idea of the audit of our curriculum. We use understanding by design as our key framework, and we also are a PLC school. So our curriculum audit focused on those practices predominantly. So for example, the way we did it is we had a bunch of look fors that had some of these things. It's just example. I didn't want to give you the whole audit tool because it's quite comprehensive. But we did this in a couple ways. One, we did what you would call a random dipstick as a team. So we came together as a team and say, pull up a unit and see if it has the things. Just see if it has it. And we did that a few times. The other thing we did is we had PLC leaders self-report. So they would say, for example, do we have power standards? Do we have learning targets? Do we have common assessments? So we had, what was good about that is we had some data was self-report, and then some data was us actually seeing the current reality. So they did some of the work for us. So we were really looking for those things like, oh, do they have performance assessments? And if so, do they have essential questions, etc. The other thing we had them do that we had them self-report on, and this one's hard to do in terms of like you finding out yourself, but we did have them do kind of a Likert scale of some PLC practices. So I'm sure many of you out there are PLC schools, so none of this will be a shocker in terms of that, but we know it's important to the functioning of our curriculum program that teachers are engaged in that process. So it might have, for example, a Likert scale about unpacking standards, and it might say something like, our team unpacks standards to understand the essential learning together. And they might rate strongly agree or strongly disagree. Or we might say, our team uses data to inform our regular instructional practices. Or our team norms our assessments before giving them to students. Our team plans for interventions, our team plans for extension, etc. And we only gave those to the PLC leader because, again, one of the challenges with data collection is I would argue survey fatigue and other methods, right? We're all over surveyed and over asked for data. So I would recommend thinking through that and thinking through how you can mitigate surveys with your general faculty, maybe one or two, and really leverage maybe some of those teacher leaders to say, hey, we're going to ask you to do one self-report out about your PLC. So that's how we did our curriculum audit, again, by UBD framework and by PLC structures in that. And we did that both for, we've done that for social studies. We did that even in, in some PLC practices, we did that in learning support. They're doing it in our near native Chinese. We did it in math. So it's the same. And what's really great about that is we don't have to make a new tool again. So, once you make your curriculum audit tool, it's the same. Now you could, if you feel like you could have maybe content specific questions, but I'm actually going to show you an example about that for math. But I highly recommend for this one to keep it very generic. One, so the tool is not, you don't have to redo the tool all the time. We spent a lot of time building these tools, and now it's nice because we don't have to do it again.
Andrew, can I jump in before you move on to this? There's a question about pre-assessing and understanding the terms before having people self-report. So in this instance, we have spent a lot of time developing understandings around PLCs, and so we didn't have to. However, if people did not, understand these terms, you would really want to calibrate. So one thing, as Andrew will share the look for tool in a moment that we use for the math learning walks, one thing we realized was that we hadn't calibrated as well as we really wanted to. And so that was really important. So yes, definitely you need to make sure that everybody's on the same page with the terms.
Yes. And I remember I talked to a couple of teachers, they said, I don't know what that is. I'm like, you know what, just, there was an NA option, I think. And so I said, just mark it non-applicable, it's data. It's okay if that happens. It's, you know, you're looking for the big picture, right? So don't worry too much about the nit. Like if a couple teachers are like, I don't know what this means, it's like, that's okay. Just mark it, I don't know, or I don't understand, or not applicable, if you have that option in there as well. So that helps you. Back to this, the next step here is this idea of instructional observations. Oops, I skipped ahead way a little too far. This one's big and scary, so I'm not going to go through it bit by bit by bit, but I am going to talk through, and Gynelle, of course, can chime in at any time, but this is really important to get into classrooms, and getting your team to get into classrooms. And so one thing we could have done better, and one thing that we did better the next time was we started together in small groups, for example, go into a classroom and start checking off and saying, did you see that? Because I saw that. Oh, I didn't see that. Oh, you think that that's a rich task? Why do you think that's a rich task? I didn't see a rich task. Or, hey, I thought that was procedural skill and fluency, not conceptual understanding. Clarify my thinking on that. So that helps you calibrate it. And doing that a couple times is a really important thing to do. And then maybe just having one person submit the actual result, for example. So you might walk around with iPads or even a piece of paper. I've seen this done in a couple ways. I've seen people just do it on paper and do the data entry later. And some people prefer that because they could just quickly do it on a piece of paper and then they just click on the form later, and we give them time in that meeting. That also, if you have iPads, it's just nice to go click and just make it happen, you know, and just get her done. There's a lot of ways you can do this. If you feel that the team is strong and knows these things, you can let them go individually and go for it. If you're kind of in that place of, I don't know if they're really doing this, then maybe pairs is a way to go. And I think we did it in pairs, didn't we, Gynelle? I think we did. And I think that was a good way to do it personally, because it allowed me to kind of, if I was kind of like, I don't know, you know, and then one person would submit it. And we spent a good, I think, half day in chunks. Like I think we did like an hour and a half chunk, break, and then another hour and a half chunk. And here was the challenge for us, that we spread it out over a full day. So the reason is we had to look for scheduling. And this is where Gynelle was like a godsend to us, as she took the ES schedules and the MS schedules and just said, okay, here's our schedule. We're going to MS between this time and this time. We're going to grades 3 and 4 during this time. And so that's hard. I'm going to say that's really hard work. And so you need to have, you know, whoever your master schedule guru is at your school, sit down and say, this is when math occurs, and then just go in there. And again, you're spending maybe 10 minutes max in that classroom. And it's not about seeing all the things. It's just about, what are you seeing? The data will tell the story. It doesn't matter if it's the beginning, the end, you can do that. That's the other thing. If you want, you can also mark, you could have an example in here, like what part of the lesson was it? Beginning, middle, end. And you can also use that as a data point. Gynelle, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think what I would add is that this tool has a lot of things. So normally when you do learning walks to monitor, you wouldn't have that many things. It's really difficult. But because, as Andrew was saying, we were really just trying to give examples of every little thing, so that we can say, oh yes, this is what the teacher was doing. We were trying to encompass everything. That's why it looks so overwhelming. This wouldn't be a normal practice, but it really was hard with that many items on there. I would say really try to synthesize across the divisions, like what specifically you're really looking for.
Yeah. And again, you'll notice this one is very math-based. And I think that's a choice that you can make. You can, if you really want to look for those math-related practices, go for it and have them. That being said, one of the things that we're working on at our school is having you may have heard of Jim Knight's work in the instructional playbook. we're building ours out right now, our instructional playbook. And those are just in general great teaching practices, like, do you have learning targets, our collaborative learning, reflection, modeling, just tried and true things that are good. If you have a Marzano framework, if you have Charlotte Danielson, you can use that too as your look for document. That being said, those generic practices are good, but you might want to look for more discipline specific practices. Example, if I was doing our science review right now, I might want very specific look fors around, is the teacher engaging students in creating science models from the NGSS? Or is the teacher engaging students in cross-cutting concepts, right? So you might have both a generic look fors and then your very specific discipline look fors that you supplement to make sure for those things.
There's one other question. The question is, are these look fors something that were shared with the teachers in advance, already a part of the instructional expectations, or solely based on the lit review? A lot of it was based on the lit review. Mm-hmm. I would say there are pockets of teachers, which is one of the reasons why we engaged in the math review. Some teachers do these types of things in their classrooms, some do not. We did not share the tool with people ahead of time. I don't think, Andrew, did we? I don't think we did.
And we don't want to, because this is the thing. You want it to be just a quick thing, right? You don't want to sabotage the data collection. It's either there or it's not. We don't want teachers like doing the dog and pony show, right? Yeah. For lack of a better idiom that may not translate. And the other thing that I'll highlight on here is there's a collection of things that are current reality and future. So, or what we would hope, because I would argue, for example, what is the math that is happening? These are things we want to see. We would want to see. Yeah. So we want to see, if we're not seeing those things, then we have a problem. Similarly here, like with the teacher doing, do we want them, are they posing interesting and challenging questions? That's something we want. It may not be something that's currently happening. That being said, on the flip side, engaging in worksheets, that might be a current reality. Taking notes, probably a current reality. Giving feedback, a current reality. But there's a bit of both.
Yeah, and I think that's why you need, well, like when Andrew and I talked about partnerships, of having like someone from your central office, and then someone who is maybe a content expert. If you're going to do specific content things, like I was able to access the literature pretty easily. If you weren't familiar with these things, it would take you quite a long time. So that's a good way to work that was, I think, really useful for our partnership.
Yeah. Oh, and that's just more stuff to look for. Sorry, more stuff. We don't need more stuff. Plenty of things to look for. Okay, some other things to think about. Here are some other data tools, because I'm not going to go through every possible data tool. You get to decide what you need. But here are some of the things that we either did use in the math process, or are using now, or will be using in the future. We use you'll see the qualitative on this side, lots of focus groups and or interviews. One of the things that I really appreciated about the near native Chinese, and then we also did this in social studies, is we interviewed admin. We went to admin and say, tell us your thoughts on X. And I think that was a really good strategy that we didn't necessarily do in math, but we still got good data. It's just that it comes down to, actually, we really, really do need to check in with our administrators about this and what their hopes and fears are, or what they really want to be seeing in the classrooms. So that was something that you could do. But also notice college counseling and your, personal counselors. I know it might seem weird, like, why would we talk to personal counselors about math? Or why would we talk to personal counselors, for example, about social studies? They're going to add a social emotional lens that you're not hearing. And it really spoke to us personally in math, but also in social studies, around safety, around kids feeling like they're able to share their opinions about kids' stress and anxiety level. So I really encourage you to really think broad and think about possibilities beyond the normal that we would connect with. The other ones, and then I'll let Gynelle chime in here, is lots of quantitative possibilities here. Of course, you're going to use, your PISA work or your AP enrollment and exams, your MAP data. We also use a couple of tools. We use AimsWeb. We use Tripod, which is a tool that students use to share feedback around instruction in a quantitative way. There's also qualitative questions in there on the side note. And then Panorama is a new tool that we've been using, which is all about social emotional, and it allows students to share things like that, feeling safe. And then we had a survey that we used with faculty and with alumni. So those are just some examples of things that we've used. And I'll talk a little bit more, but before we do that, I think there's a question, Gynelle, if you want to chime in.
Oh, no, she was talking about the structure. Someone asked about the structure of the parent focus groups, which you're going to get to.
Yes.
The only other thing I would say about the student focus groups, we decided to go down to grade 3 only.
Fair.
So there is some data that says it's, that's a good age to start with. So we started at 3rd grade and we really looked at the different criteria. Like, for example, we have a math lab in the 5th grade. So we were trying to decide what kind of criteria do we want for these different focus groups, which Andrew will share a little bit too. But like, for example, in the elementary school, we have a math lab that not every kid gets to go to. So we chose some kids who didn't go to math lab, but still did well. And some kids who go to math lab, but didn't do well. So we looked at lots of data to decide our focus groups as well.
I think there was a raised hand.
Yes, I see. Jack. Is it Jacqueline?
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
So as a former math teacher, and I'm going to be a curriculum coordinator next year, something I've always been a little bit hesitant about is asking parents and students about what they think math instruction should be, because people only know what they've experienced in a lot of cases. So I'd love to see I know you mentioned showing some examples perhaps of questions. To what extent, kind of big picture, to what extent do you need to push people to consider what they maybe haven't experienced themselves? And also, does the review or redesign process need to reflect this data? Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think one of the things that's really important as well is that rapid framework, and to be clear that they're not making the decisions. We do want to listen to them and build that partnership, but it was very clear that we are gathering all this input and making recommendations based on that. So for example, I mean, as a math person, if someone just wants to have rote procedural things, and that's what they decided because that's how they grew up, you have research and different things and all of the rest of the data to come together to say, actually, that's not what's best. And so it's not like you're just soliciting things from them or listening things from them and then they're deciding. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, the other thing I'll say is parent focus. These are all one parts of a whole. So you may have one data set that says do it this way, but then everything else says do it another way. So even if you see data that says, I want my kids to, and maybe in your head, you're going, that's not what I want, you gotta put your bias in the background and really listen and just open that door and see what happens. And then as the data comes together, you bring it to the team and they say, well, there's some outliers here. How do we address that? And that's okay. It's going to be okay. And actually it's a good segue into parent focus groups. And sharing with you, because I think they're a very high leverage and honestly a politically challenging structure, but I actually have grown to love them. I know that sounds strange, but I really enjoy them because it's an opportunity as a leader to build partnerships. It's an opportunity to eventually feed back to them that we hear you and we are making changes. It really leads to good conversations. And so I want to talk with you about how we structure them and things we thought through. The first thing that I want to mention, is it going? What's going on? Is here's some considerations. And there's no right or wrong way around this. And I've done it in different ways and others have done it in different ways. So do you go by grade bands or divisions? You could. I know in counseling, when they're reviewing right now, they did that. For parent focus groups, they did lower elementary, upper elementary, middle school, and then high school. So they did 4 focus groups with parents in a grade band or divisional manner. Back to what Gynelle is saying, cognitive readiness of students, if you're thinking through student focus groups, we thought age 3 was appropriate. You've got to think through that and thinking through the types of questions you're going to ask. The other thing is do you go by topic or do you do general? We for math and social studies, we did topical, and for social studies, I did a more generic open one as just kind of a supplement because I just wanted more people to show up. Consider the number of them. There's no right or wrong way. It really depends on how you structure them. I found the sweet spot is usually between 3 and 6. Anything more than that, you're probably going a little crazy with that, and it's a lot to do and a lot of data to look through. And of course, Zoom or in person, right? You know, some of us may not have that choice, and it might be Zoom or in person or both. And that actually segues to, we did both. We've done both. And so with that, I think there are pros and cons to both. With Zoom, you can do it anytime, anywhere, and anyone can join in, and you can have as many people, and parents can be at work and they can Zoom in for an hour or whatever. They don't have to come to school. You know, and for us right now, if you come onto our campus, you have to take an ART test. So, you know, and then there's COVID and all that stuff. And so it's kind of like, okay. So during math, we had no choice. We had to do them on Zoom. When we did social studies, we did most of them in person, but in order to increase turnout, we offered one more on Zoom, and we got a lot of turnout because some parents were saying, you know, I want to come, I just can't make it to school. And could you do it at this time instead? Because it's right, you know, during the day, I'm working, et cetera. So I said, okay, we'll do one after school on Zoom between this time and this time. So I think both are great, to be honest. And I would actually advocate, as things move forward, you consider both as an option because they have their pros and cons with that. Gynelle, you want to add anything or?
Nope.
Okay. Here's the thing. It's really specific to, I think, focus groups. At one point, and I was actually talking with a colleague at work today who was doing focus groups, and he was saying, I'm just getting the same thing. Oh, this is exhausting. And I'm like, I hear you, man. I hear you. Absolutely. You are going to saturate your data, but it's not just saturation of data that's important. It's also engaging with the community. If you can come out and say, we had 6 parent focus groups and a total of 120 parents or more, wow. Like that speaks a lot. And people go, wow, a lot of people shared their opinions. Now you probably will start reading the tea leaves two focus groups in. Doesn't matter. You're going to be like, I know what's going on here, but you're going to keep going and you're going to get that data and you're going to lean into it and you're going to be open and you're going to facilitate and really say, yes, absolutely. Tell me more about that. With that, I want to echo an important kind of scholar that has been resonating with me and I think articulates my reflection better than I am. Khalifa talks about culturally responsive school leadership. And he says that culturally responsive school leadership engages students, parents, and Indigenous contexts by, and this is the part that resonates with me, using the community as an informative space from which to develop positive understandings of students and families, finding overlapping spaces for school and community, and resisting deficit images of students and families. One of the things that has bothered me deeply during the pandemic was this comment. And I'm sure many of you have heard this comment. Gynelle, you know you heard this one. When we were not allowed to have parents on campus, some people said, oh, thank God, man, you know, gosh, just get them out of my hair. And that is a deficit image. And it really bugged me. And I had to push back and be like, hold on now. I know it's challenging as a teacher. I know sometimes, you know, we might call them helicopter parents or whatever term, but they matter and their voices matter. And we have to use them as an informative space. That's only going to pay us dividends in the long run. And so as you message this work, really embrace that and find ways to counter that narrative. Because you're right, parents have very strong opinions, and rightfully so, because we're serving their children and they want things to go well for them. And so we need to listen and lean into that. Ultimately, we're going to make great decisions, but in this process of having a focus group, listen, paraphrase, get that data and honor that data and help your team to also shift that space. One of the things I had to work with my team was We need to honor this voice. And here's the irony of it. Many of the teachers who are in this review team, they're parents. They have kids in the school. So why would we not honor their thinking as well? And so I just want to really, really emphasize this one. One is a personal thing to think about as a leader, but also a communication thing to really echo in this process that our parents and our community matters. And our job in being responsive to our community and its culture is to push back against deficit and really think about how we use them. So I'll jump off my pedestal there, but it's really, I just think it's really important. It's been a big reflection for me. A couple other things to think about before I go into the structure of the focus groups. One, we are lucky enough to have an amazing communications office, an amazing communication liaison. And I know many of you have that as well. Maybe not both, but some resources that might support you. We were able to just work with our community liaison and say, can you schedule them during this week? And we will just show up. We work with communications to help us create slides that would help us move it from educationese to layman's terms to language that teachers would understand, help really siphon our message so that we're really focusing on the core of what we're doing. So I really encourage you, as you think about interacting with parents, get those people to get their eyes on what you're doing. Oh my gosh, they're just a lifesaver in terms of, one, saves you time and also just gets you the best bang for your buck.
Amanda, I saw Amanda. Did your hand went up and then went down? Did you have a question before we move on?
I was just celebrating the welcoming. I was clapping.
Okay, good.
Welcoming families into the school again, because I agree completely that we're too excited to not have them there.
Oh,
Yeah.
It's really unfortunate, and it's an ongoing struggle, but I just think that if the intent of this process is to improve learners, like improve the situation for all learners, then we have to connect with those who the learners connect with, which are their parents and community stakeholders. So there's that. That being said, these meetings can be tough. I'm not saying they're not. Anybody in this room who's like, hey, you got your parent coffees and your engagements, they're tough. I mean, talk about literally just putting a target on your chest and saying, go for it, let me have it. You're the representative of the school. That being said, creating some community norms with your team is really a good thing to do. We did this as a school in partnership with our PTA. So these are brought forward at PTA meetings, parent focus groups, coffees, curriculum nights, whatever it is. We have some community norms that we leverage and we use and we talk through. So make sure to have your own and craft your own and remind them at the beginning of the focus group. A couple things to think about is that a focus group is both the opportunity to provide input and to share. So you're not only, most of it's probably on input, right? Like we want to hear from you, but some of it's also about sharing out, like where are we? What have we done so far? So we also had follow-up sharing situations where we said, here are some of the themes. Here's what we're learning. Here's what we found out. Here's what you shared. So think about that in addition to the focus groups. I just want to give you a picture of the trajectory of what this can lead to. And it's really helpful because then you can start to show that you are listening and that you are hearing these things. The agenda looks something like this, pretty straightforward, and took about an hour to do for each, maybe an hour and 15. Each time we jumped in and clarified the role in the process. We shared the process of the review to remind people because we didn't know who was showing up. Sometimes people would come to this like all the time. Sometimes you had people that would come for 2, sometimes just for 1, especially if it's topical, right? So sometimes if I had one on, for example, tutoring, oh man, I might get a lot showing up for that. But if I have one, we had one on, experiential learning, some had a lot to say about it, but not as many as the other ones. Then what happens is we did breakout groups or small groups if it was in person, where we shared the questions we wanted them to talk about and just get together and talk with each other and build community. Yeah, I'm experiencing this and I'm experiencing this. In that we had, and then we would come back rather, and then I would facilitate a larger group instruction and take notes. And so I would listen and really lean into that. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to talk through that in a minute. So here's an example of session topics that we had for math. We had, as you can see, 6 of them. One was on just overall, what are our outcomes? One was on curriculum and programs. One was on teaching. One was on support. One was on extension enrichment. And one was on DEI. And we had different questions for all of those, just as an example. Here were social studies, just one less, curriculum, Singapore and Asian history. But notice that this came from our research questions. So we really wanted to find out about Singaporean Asian history in our curriculum. So we really wanted a focus group on that. And then we really wanted to focus on classroom experience and then the content that was taught. So you craft the topics based on that. Now, again, these are topically based, but I know that for learning support, for example, they did it by grade bands, and that's fine too. In that time, when they were in that small group I mentioned, when parents are at a table, there usually is someone who's taking notes, and we had iPads that we put on the table and they would type into them, or computers, and they would just type in and somebody would do that. Everyone is sharing ideas. And then we also had somebody that would share is everyone being able to share their ideas? Now, I'll be honest, does it always go the way you plan? Not always, but you try. And you try to model effective teamwork and say, this is what we try to do whenever we get together, is people have roles who can take notes for the team. So the other thing here is, remember, this is not necessarily about the frequency of what you're hearing. It's really about just the what you're hearing. This is not really a place to look for frequency. It's a place to look for what are the general themes that are coming out of this process. And so you can create roles to help with that. So as an example, here's one. This was for math, about outcomes of what we want for our kids. So for example, just part 1 was, what would you describe the goals of and again, come back to what Gynelle said, the current state. And then what do you think, what does it mean to be currently successful? And so parents would say things like, what means you do well in the test, and da. So we had things about current state. And then we had stuff about future state, want, hope, should, right? If you were to graduate, what would you hope they would leave with? What should be the purpose of math? So it was in a 2-parter, 15 minutes for one, 15 minutes for the other. And finally, we would share out as a group, and I would take notes on what I would hear and collect that data. And then, as always, I think it's really important that you allow them to give you feedback. What worked today for your session? What suggestions you have for next time? This was really helpful because in social studies, that's when we got the feedback saying, I can't come on campus. I don't want to take an ART test every single time. Can you do one on Zoom? That would be great. And I said, sure. And so we scheduled another one, but we couldn't have done that if we didn't ask. And so I encourage you to ask for that kind of, ongoing feedback around that. So that's how we did our parent focus groups. Are there any questions about that before I give it back to Gynelle to talk about systemic beliefs? And again, as we keep going, feel free to type in the chat, or we can come back at the end.
Andrew, would you also go
Julia's
back?
got a question.
Oh, good. Okay. And would you click on slide 58 on the link while she's asking the question? Hi, Julia.
Hi. I'm wondering, for parent communities that are a little hesitant or reticent to share their thoughts and beliefs openly with their peers, did you experience that? And if so, what was that like? And how might you create an equitable opportunity for all to participate, even for those who would like to keep their beliefs more private?
Yeah, great question. One thing we did is we gave the survey link, like the question link, to everybody. So even after the focus group, if they felt like maybe, oh, I don't know about sharing, they could fill out the form later, right? And get their ideas in there. So that's one strategy that we did. Gynelle?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say you're absolutely correct, because there are some, like, even culturally, that perhaps don't want to share in public. So yeah, definitely something to consider, and sending out whatever it is you're sending out to everybody is, like, we have an e-news that we send out every Friday, and that we always put things like that in there. So good question.
Another strategy is to have them at the end. Hey, if there's anything you think we need to know, write it on a note card and we'll collect them at the end. Like, that's another strategy you can use as well.
Yeah. And we
Or-
always have parents contact us and want to have private conversations, and
Yeah,
that's
we've had
fine.
individual interviews. Like I just really need to talk to you about this thing. I'm like, absolutely, let's set up a time, and we've done that.
Yep.
Should we move, Gynelle?
Yeah, I just wanted to give them an example real quick of the survey and focus group questions, how we organized it on slide 58.
Oh yeah.
I'm really a nerd for organizing things because there's so many pieces. And so
This one
just
again.
having some
Yeah.
of the tools and the way we organize can be helpful.
Sure.
And you can see some of the other questions. So we had survey and focus group questions. And so
I know it's the slow. There it is. Survey.
Yeah.
Okay.
yeah,
So here's like a student survey.
and you can see
here.
the criteria is up there and how many people we were interviewing or surveying.
So here you
Whether
got
it was a scale question, a fill in the blank, etc.
Yeah, here's the focus group questions. Describe this for alumni, elementary focus group. What does it mean to be this middle school? So we had a variety of ways of thinking through how we're going to ask those questions.
Yep.
Okay. Let's jump into again around this idea of future state and where we want to go. And I'm going to jump over, and Gynelle, you can talk all about how we got into this idea of systemic beliefs, if my computer will move fast enough here.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing, as we said before, we recognize that there were some disparities in beliefs, which is one of the reasons that we really conducted this depth of review process. And so this really started to inform our process and where do we want to go from here. And so actually it's nothing that exciting because we already shared this with you last time, but what we did was we took the polarities activity that we did with the math core team and that we revised with the core team. And then we brought it to all of the faculty. So anybody who taught math. So in the elementary school, that was everybody. Obviously, just middle school and high school is just the math faculty. These meetings, if you have a large school like ours, you need you need lots of facilitators. So we use the core math team to facilitate. And one thing I think that was really useful for them, because oftentimes it takes some different skill set to facilitate meetings. And so Andrew and we created all of the slide decks for them. And then all they had to do was copy and paste and show up and ask the questions that were on the slide. So we actually used Pear Deck and we put the polarity statements on there and collected the data through there. Is there anything to add on there, Andrew?
Yeah, no, I think this was a really good activity, and we did this to a limited extent in social studies, but I think we could have done it better. I think it's a really good idea to start to uncover those disparities in it. So highly recommend it as a data tool.
The other thing is you may become surprised. Like I actually was really surprised on some of this data, what I really thought, also with parents. I was really actually surprised with the data that we got from parents. So like Andrew said, getting rid of that bias and what you think is the right answer as people who engage in this process is really, really important.
The other thing I was going to say, this signaled for us early too, the change management that would be needed. So we could like if we know, for example, that we believe access for all is where we're headed, and everyone's there, we're like, oh, good. Well, we don't have to lead that change as strongly. But if it's like low, we might go, uh-oh, that's going to be a hard sell. So it also helps you identify where you're going to have to lean in, put your energy.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about, as our last piece here is about analyzing the data. How do you do that? What are some strategies? You got all this data, and I'll share a few examples. The core team really is your data team. It's important that you engage them in that because they're the ones that are ultimately sharing out informally and formally what's happening in the review. So one of the norms that we set was, personal things were private, but ideas could leave. So if I was on the team, I could go back and say, yeah, we looked at parent data and, in general, this is what parents were saying. or, in general, they were really concerned about this, or kids are worried about this, or I was surprised by the data that said this, right? It's important that you do that. There's lots of, I'm not going to overdo this one. Data protocols, lots of ideas here. There's what, so what, now what, that's a tried and true one. You could do that on a Jamboard. You could do that on a poster. You could do Atlas. You could do the final word protocol, right? Where you look at some data and then people respond to it and everyone gets an equitable idea. You could do a jigsaw with a round table, which is something that we're going to show you in a second. There's a questions and assumptions protocol, chalk talk, say something. Lots of data protocols out there, and we're going to share a couple highlights that we think work really well. But I would say kind of the default is always what, so what, now what. I don't know why, it just always ends up being, and it's still good, but it's important to kind of maybe try some new things, because if you're looking at all this data, man, it gets old pretty quick, right? All right, here we go again. What, so what, now what? Oh boy, we've done this one to death. Like, think about other ways of doing it to keep the data analysis a little interesting for your team.
Yes. So this is just a sample. One of the things that Andrew and I, though, really had to consider was what raw data. We had so much data. And so we had to decide what raw data gets shared for analysis with the team and what themed data gets shared with the team. So that will be a consideration as you move forward. For this particular one, we looked at the polarity statement, the math belief data, and we had all of the data there. And then we broke it up by, like, you can see purpose and philosophy. And then the people went into those questions and they themed it for us there.
Yeah, I think your point is really important, Gynelle, because, like, for example, I didn't want, because the sample size for the college counselors was so small, I did it myself. And I brought it to them and I said, here's the themes, guys. And then we would discuss it and react to it, but we wouldn't go into the data deeply. So I think you also, so that discussion about what are the ones that we really want teachers, the teaching review team, to wrestle with, that's the one you want to put in front of them, but you don't have to do it all. Don't. It's too much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So here's
the
a couple
next
more.
one is just a sample. You can see curriculum instruction or curriculum assessment instruction. They just pulled some themes from that data, from the, I'm trying to look and see, from various different things. I believe that was from the belief data. Yeah, and you can see the what, so what, now what, except for they got it backwards. So
what, now what,
it's a little backwards, but it worked.
Yeah. And there was a question in the chat that actually just feeds right into this. It's what would you recommend? I mean, we all have sources. I like Lipton's work in data and cultures of data. So I recommend that as a tool. I'm sure many of us are into that. I also like DataWise, which is again from Harvard, and they've got some really good data tools and things to think about there. Those are my top. I also like National School Reform Faculty Protocols. Those are out there and pretty good, and they have some good data things that you can use. I want to touch on this one specifically because I think it's a fun one, and it's really good for really rich data. Like, I think you could do this one for parents and faculty and even students in terms of some of the qualitative data. But in this one, this idea is really about thinking through the process of data, not just looking at the data, but preparing to look at the data, exploring it, and then organizing and integrating it. So it really slows the process down, but I find it to be very, very effective. So for example, you might predict what the data looks like. What do we think we're going to see before looking at it, right? What do we think are, and this is a good thing to do, just like we predict text. This is something you can do. We think we might see parents will be happy with this or concerned about this. We think that students will celebrate this and really want this to happen in our curriculum. And then surface our own assumptions. Why do we think that is the thing? So it helps people name their bias. I say that this is a problem because I'll be honest, I've heard it, I've experienced it with parents, so I'm thinking that's going to happen. Then you give people time in groups to just silently look at the data, that quiet think time. And really it's about observations, not about conclusions. What do we see? What's the data saying? Then you chart that observations and on that, as in parents, there's parent concerns are around this, not what are we going to do about it, but faculty really want X, and you start to chart that. And then I really like this way of thinking through it. What is our, this is kind of related to the so what, but digging into causal categories. So for example, if parents are saying they're unhappy with the experiential learning that's occurring, I'm just naming that data came out. Is that a curriculum problem? Is it an infrastructure problem, like resources and time? Is it a teaching problem, as in the teachers are ill-equipped or don't know what to do? So then you start to dig in and think about the so what in a more scaffolded way. Because sometimes people think, for example, oh, well, if we just taught better, that would solve the problem. And the answer might be, well, maybe it's not teaching, maybe it's actually infrastructural, or vice versa. We might jump to conclusions and say, well, if we just had more money, things would be better. Or if we just had more FTE. You could say, yes, and what about the actual curriculum? Or what about the assessment practices? What do you think caused those outcomes? So I really like looking through it and mining the data for this, and helps because here's the thing, if you do that, it allows the recommendations, which we will talk about next time, to be richer. It allows them to say, it's not just a teaching problem, it's also a curriculum problem. It's not just an assessment problem. There's students' concerns that we have to address, like social emotional, for example. So it allows you to really think through the causal categories. And again, this is from Lipton's work, from that work there. I think we have a few questions running in here. Oh yeah, let me put in the data tools. Yeah, let me put them in here right now before I move forward. So there's data wise. There's people are putting them in there. Thank you for sharing. There's got data by Lipton, putting that in there. And then there's NSRF protocols that's going in the chat as well. So those are some things that might help you out in terms of that. Yeah. The so what, now what, that's right. Thank you for everyone sharing out your tools. Yeah, and please, yeah, Gynelle's saying, if you got a good one, please. I mean, we're all in this together, and everyone's got that. This one's a good one, though. I just like to highlight it because, it's that one. It's one of my favorites. And then again, as you start to do this, you're going to get really great themes. You're going to, this is some of the sample themes that are emerging out of our current data for social studies. That it needs to be less American centric, or that there needs to be better coverage of the world wars, or that the classroom experience needs to have more primary resources, or there's pressure on that AP work. And so you start to theme that data and get some really good ideas that then inform your recommendations. So I just want to name that theming is really important, and coding. Now, related to that, I just want to share is, hire a data specialist. Oh my gosh, I know it's an FTE resource, but we are so privileged to have a data specialist and on campus that helps us with everything from our map data to our AP data to surveys and this work. We also have, there's an amazing elementary school teacher that also just is a data geek and has high skills in it and has helped us. So if you can't hire a data specialist, maybe get a stipended position for somebody to support you in theming data or coding data. This is really helpful for that qualitative data that you're getting, as well as representing it in, representing quantitative in tables and charts and stuff. But if you have somebody who has the know-how, really leverage them as part of that process, because I got to tell you, it's really saved us time. And again, it goes back to the other question, the other consideration that I want to name, which is you don't have to have the team theme all the data or uncover it. Figure out the most important ones. The little ones, the low-hanging fruit, just bring it to them. Just bring it to them. So for example, I brought our AP enrollment data and things to them. I did that myself. And I said, here's what we're finding. What do you guys think? What does this make us think about? What connections can we make to other data we're seeing? But I didn't have them literally organize and sort the data. That would be kind of mean and cruel and unusual. So with that, we're up on the hour. Perfect timing. any questions that people have, either raise hands or just jump on the thing or chat. We're here to answer any questions again around data and how we made it happen. See that wait time? Just saying.
Here's a question. How many people on the core team had access to the raw data to be able to play with it kind of in their own time and come prepared to a meeting already ready to share? Or did you really try to keep people from digging into it without that structure of the meetings?
I know with some of the, I'm not sure about the focus groups, but the student data, I was all available. We of course didn't want people to share it out with others, right? But it was all available. They could look at it whenever they wanted.
Yeah. Sometimes, remember that process I shared you predicting, I wouldn't share it right away, right? Maybe they could go back to it, but we did have some confidentiality that we, please do not share the raw data widely with the community, that this is for us to look at, but we can share the themes and the ideas. Absolutely. If you want to go, for example, if I have a teacher in middle school that says, hey, can I share what parents are saying? Yeah, go share the big ideas. Please do. Please share. There's nothing to hide here, right? We want to be as transparent as possible, but we don't want to necessarily share the raw data because sometimes things might be worded in ways that might identify an individual, for example, or maybe just are so raw that it might rub somebody the wrong way. You know what I mean? So themes are great, and the team should have access to the raw data, absolutely, but it probably doesn't go outside the committee. The question, how regularly did the committee share out their findings to the wider community? That's an area of growth for us. We did it, they were allowed, at the end of every meeting, we tried to do our best to say, what do we share out? Like, what's important to share out? Like, what's a key point from today? What are we leaving this room? So every meeting, they would share out maybe something or a couple things that they were allowed to share out. In terms of formal, like, share outs, like when we started to collect data and recommendations, we then engaged with the larger community on the findings. And I'm going to talk next week, around that communication around findings and recommendations. And once you get those things, how do you communicate out and start to message it to the larger community? But the committee shared it out with their faculty teams very regularly. The parent community, not as much, but we did share a midway checkpoint at the end of the parent focus groups. We said, hey, thank you so much. Here are some of the themes that came out. You're concerned around this. Parents are wondering about this. And it was just a shorter list than everything. And so that's a strategy that might work for you to say, we're listening and we're going to get back to you. So as we can continue to move, did you do any data analysis to determine student learning growth? Yes, we did. We absolutely, I'll put it this way. Our map data really helped us with that ideas like, VCG control groups and things like that to look for those areas of, are there gaps? For example, we found some gaps between 5th grade and 6th grade through that transition. And so that gave us some pause about how do we approach that. But we did do some of that within our existing control rather our data that allows us to do that kind of work. Yes. Pared down version of the process from Eric. Yeah, for sure. So areas to pare down are how far do you cast your review? So last time we talked about the research questions, maybe just focus it on a few. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's 4 or 5 versus 10. Similarly, pare down the data collection. Maybe you don't need all, like we mentioned a million things, maybe you don't. And related to that, you might do less qualitative and more quantitative in that case, because you're just going to use what you already have, right? You're going to use your MAP scores, or you're going to use your surveys are a good way to do it too. I would argue that, you may not do as many focus groups, but I think the higher leverage ones are probably going to be your parents. I would argue that. And if you can, maybe a small group of students as well. But again, pare it down as you can.
And also I would say, like with math, we knew that we needed to create a vision because we didn't have one. Sometimes you might not need to do that. So the literature review piece could also be pared down in that case.
Yeah. Like you could just do that yourself, or you could do some research and find expert, like this is what good math is. And it's more about, we're not going to do the lit review. We're just going to tell you what it is. So next time, let's talk about next time. After we get the data, how do we get recommendations out of this data? How do you move from dialogue to decisions, dialogue to discussion, right? And then once you have that, how do you start to engage the community? What are those next steps? How do you communicate to your faculty, to your parents? And finally, how do you start to action those recommendations? What comes first? What's important? And then frankly, planning for further decision-making, because here's the thing, out of your review will come more work to do. And so then you have to think through, and how will those decisions be made and who's making them? And so we'll talk about that. Well, thank you everyone for your time.
Yes.
I hope everyone's well. And hopefully we'll see you all next week for the final installment of our TV series.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for being
Good
here. Thank you for
night.
the claps and the thank yous. We appreciate it. We miss you too, AZM.